All right, so I'm not sure how far I'm going to get on this thought exercise. It's a little bit a work in progress in my mind. It took me through several sort of different branching paths of which way I could go with it, and I sort of want to go to all of them. But sometimes in order to make an idea coherent in the verbal realm, it can be, sort of an opportunity cost to choose one over the others, and then, it's like you want to explain the whole big picture of the sense of something, but then if you only go down one path, you risk confusing people, because it's like if they only understand that branch of it, then they might think of you as, they might get the wrong idea about the idea that you're trying to present. So I was pondering a lot about nature and how nature can be a very violent and unforgiving place, and as human beings we don't really take issue with that from the point of view of that it's something that is separate from us, and it's just the way of things, and we don't really take it personal when when animals do the horrific things that you can sometimes witness on documentaries and stuff. But the way we view human beings is very different than from animals, and we sort of it's funny how we use this word anthropomorphize. We use this word when we attribute human values onto animals, but I think we sort of anthropomorphize ourselves because we don't really fully understand what we are, and we don't really fully understand what our nature is. And so I think sometimes we get lost in this, in the many ideas that we have this expectation, and our expectations, most of us become disillusioned at some point about reality and how things function and what it means to be a human being. And so we get very angry. I think a lot of people get very angry about what human beings are actually like, and we sort of expect that the norm should be that human beings are at least decent, and yet it seems like perhaps the norm is actually quite the opposite of that, at least when we look at the way we define decent and how we expect decent behavior, and what we receive is what we call indecent. And yet it seems to be the function of nature to prove us wrong, that our idea of decency is somehow, I don't know if it's what we should want, but it's perhaps not what we should expect. We might want to have decent behavior, but it's not necessarily something we should in a sort of logical sense. It's not something we should expect. So this idea of decency is kind of an anthropomorphic view of the world And we take a lot of things very personal when they happen to us, and we observe them in the realm of human beings, but we don't take them as personal in nature. And so the reality of what human beings do is very similar to what animals do. What human beings do is all about survival. And so everyone has their survival strategies. Whether they're effective or not, emotionally, they're what people learn is to survive in a specific kind of way. And in some cases, people come up with some very malicious survival strategies, and then we call it narcissism, sociopathy, borderline. Those are the big ones that are like personality disorders used by psychologists in the DSM. But all of those are, they're human beings, perhaps at their worst, and the way we sort of define human beings. But really, all of these people have characteristics that are present in all of us, and these characteristics aren't inherently negative. They're inherently there for survival. And it's only in sort of it's in an unfortunate circumstance in these people that they've so been damaged, whether it's damaged by nature and the way they were born from, maybe from birth they were predisposed to having these conditions, or maybe they had trauma. A lot of it, I think, has to do with trauma, based on what I've researched and I've heard lately. So, but those are, even those are like the rare, those are really rare conditions, and we all like to use these terms to describe the people in our world. But the reality is these people are actually very rare, and the reason we like to use these words is because we like to be descriptive of what we observe in our more normal day-to-day lives. And what we witness in normal people, we can, if we select certain traits that we observe in other people, we can label them as these things, even though they don't really actually clinically wouldn't fit that. What it fits more is the norm of what human beings will do under stress, in a stressed environment. And I'm not saying stress here in the sense that there should be something other than a stressed environment, because I think stress is somewhat, if you look at nature in general, the way outside of the human realm, stress is a constant factor in animal life. And animals are very aggressive, and they fight for their lives, and they fight to the death. And that's pretty much what human beings do. They're very aggressive, and they fight to the death, only it's much more, because human beings are so much more complicated, the way we fight each other is much more subversive and indirect and calculated in subconscious and subconscious ways. And so most of us, when we ask ourselves and we ask our friends, they'll tell us that we're a decent person. But the reality is that most of us would not necessarily be considered decent by everyone in the world if we sort of take a step back and look at ourselves and how we operate. So what I'm trying to say here is, when we think in terms of good and bad and right and wrong and good and evil, there's this moral pain that we have that we're always fighting against. At the same time, while we fight the world and those around us, we're also fighting this internal battle of moral pain. And we get hung up on it when other people label us, when we get into a fight with somebody and they've decided that we're the villain, then because most of us have some self, inquiry and self-reflectiveness and mirror neurons and empathy and all these things, we ask ourselves, well, is this true about me? Am I the villain? And so we assume that if we ask ourselves this question and then the answer we come up with is yes, we are so terrified of finding out that the answer might be yes. So what we do instead is we do a lot of trying to do a long way around it, like we try to disprove essentially that we're a villain, and we fight to the death to prove that we're not a villain, and we get into battles with other people to prove that we're not a villain, because the question is so, whatever word you want to use for villain here is so, we're taught to be so allergic to this idea that we're bad, that what we end up doing is we create more chaos, more destruction, more conflict in order to prove that we're the good guys. And then, when somebody asks us why we did the things we did, we tell them we had to, because it was required of us because of the circumstances. And what I'm my takeaway here is not to try to sell some idea about being a better person, but what I'm trying to say is that maybe this idea, here, let's go this way, this idea of what it means to be a villain, maybe we don't really know. Maybe our human minds don't really have a good compass to be able to tell what is good and what is evil. And so when somebody calls us evil and we assume that we know what evil is, and if we look like what evil looks like, then we're evil. But perhaps the whole assumption, maybe perhaps everything that comes along with this is based on a false assumption that we have this idea of evil and that we're correct about what it means. So a lot of, I think, suffering comes from this identity that we are bad we're shameful, we're cruel, we're evil. And yet, when we come to that conclusion, there's no way, there's no real way out of it, because behind the conclusion is more of an emotion. And the words that we use to define ourselves are just something that we've captured ourselves with and trapped ourselves with into this emotion of bad person identity. And so it doesn't even matter if you change your ways, you're still this bad person internally, because it's not just that you're doing bad things, it's that you're somehow inherently bad. You're inherently bad, and you can work your entire life and you'll still never be good. And even if you do good, you'll still feel like every time you make a moral compromise, you'll still feel that shame. And so the way I was thinking about it is, what if when somebody accused us of being evil in some, subtle or more obvious way, maybe there's a different way of looking what evil means. And if we can hear what they're saying and not necessarily disagree with them about what they believe to be evil, but more to see things as they are, rather than the story about evil. And so if we just see, not in terms of what is evil and what is good, but what is the actuality of what my behavior is, and what is the actuality of what their behavior is. And then remember that you are not this fully autonomous being that is able to be so fully conscious that you're somehow separate from nature. And to remember that nature has a lot of things in it that just don't make sense from a human point of view. And yet, from nature's point of view, it makes perfect sense. And it makes absolute logical sense. Because nature doesn't ask questions in the same way we ask questions. Nature simply allows for things to be as they are without interference or judgment. And what works in nature is sometimes very, we take it very personally as human beings. And yet, if we can somehow let go of that way in which we take it personal and see it more as the way things are, and do our best to understand the way things are, and then remember that even if we understand to whatever extent we understand, there's still so much more that we can't even fathom that is at play here. Then perhaps we can begin to make decisions more from a conscious place. Conscious, not out of fear, not out of repentance, but out of clarity, out of the clarity of what is it, if I want to do, for example, if I want to do things motivated by love, well, first of all, we got to know what we define as love, but when you find what you've defined your love to be, and it doesn't really matter if it's the same love as somebody else's love. If you have a different idea, I'm just using this love as an example. If you want to do loving things, what does it take to do loving actions? What is the reality of it? What is the real method that I can find or create? What are the real components of the love that I feel and that I want to share and spread? And what is the reality of love? Not get so tangled up in everything else that defines us something else, but to stay focused solely on what our objective is in this life. I mean, you can have different objectives than love. I can, give anyone that. A lot of people want to do selfish acts, and perhaps they can take what I say here and, think up whatever it is that they can do pragmatically and justify it. And that's, I'm not here to judge them. It's not what I'm about. But what I'm saying is we need to choose what our objectives are in life and forget everything else that slows us down, everything that makes us hesitate to achieve what it is that we want to achieve, and let go of the guilt and the shame and all these counterproductive things that make us into animals that don't really flow or function well, because we hate to see ourselves as the lion that is chewing on the gazelle's dead body. But in some way, that is what most of us are. But if we want to be something other than that, then we need to see clearly first what is, and not delude ourselves about what we're doing and what we're really trying to achieve. And so, if we want to move through life in a more effortless way, I think first of all, I think we need to learn how to let go of what other people mean when they say mean things. And instead, not necessarily agree with their premise of what they believe to be wrong, because they may believe something to be wrong, but they may have no real foundation themselves to stand on it, to be somebody, to accuse somebody else of something when they might be far more destructive in all sorts of ways, and all sorts of more subtle ways, and ruin more lives, and yet they catch you doing something, and because what you're doing is more easily reproached by society and the world, they can attack you and you end up feeling shame and guilt, and they get to walk away and continuing to do their destructive behaviors that are sort of sanctioned by the world. But we don't have to take that personal. The best medicine, I think, for the world, for life, the way life is to just recognize the reality of it, and then to figure out what it is that we want out of life, and then be really honest with ourselves if that is really what we want, and then to figure out what are the practical ways of achieving that. And even if I can only move the ball very forward, a very short distance, then that's what I'm gonna do. Anyhow, so yeah, I'm not sure if I quite fully expressed what I wanted to express here, but I gave it my best shot, and I'm just happy that my voice is still my own and that I'm still able to speak. I'm always a little bit shocked and surprised when my mouth opens and I'm able to form an intelligible sentence because of lots of circumstances in my life that has created some challenges in that arena for me. But yeah, anyhow, I think I'll leave it here, and you guys have a good one.